Hi Sugar Snaps, welcome to the studio and welcome to my pine needle basket weaving series. I'm doing a series on pine needle basket coiling, and today I want to share the tools involved in making pine needle baskets. So let's go over the tools and materials you will need. Check out the description below for a link to all of the resources that I'll be talking about today. I have those all listed on my website with places that you can purchase these items yourself if you want to explore pine needle basketry. Be sure to check out my other pine needle basket weaving videos on Textile Indie YouTube channel. You can find more information about that in the description below, as well as on my website textileindie.com. Now let's dive into the materials and tools you need for pine needle basketry. The first material you need for pine needle coil basketry are obviously pine needles, and I'm using ponderosa pine needles. These are pine needles that are about 5 to 7 inches in length, and this branch is one that is fresh. I picked this up off the ground a few days ago. It's still going through the process of drying, and these needles are green because it fell in a windstorm, so they're still fresh and maintain their nice rich color. As they dry, they'll fade in color and become more of this muted green, like this dried one here. You can see the difference. And I have a video on cleaning, gathering, and preparing your pine needles. You can find that up here in the little eye, as well as in the description below for more information on where to find pine needles and how to gather them. If you find needles like this that are brown, these are usually either older needles that browned in the sun on the tree, or they fell and they've been on the ground for a while. When you're picking up pine needles, try to find some that don't have mildew marks or mold on them. That causes the quality of the pine needle to be less and will cause the quality of your basket to be less as well. I also have this bin. This bin is a collection of needles that I raked up from my backyard. Again, I have a pine tree in my backyard, so it's easy for me to find pine needles. If you are gathering, you can look in parks or in forests around your area. Be sure to do your foraging legally and make sure you have permits if you need them, or that you're not trespassing on private property, that sort of thing. So these are pine needles that I still need to go through. Some of them are broken, like this one here, so they might not all be high quality. This one is nicely formed. It's still combined together, and I can run my hand along it and see that there aren't any mold or mildew spots. There is some discoloration from sitting on the ground, but it still would be a good pine needle for a basket. So I can sort through this bin and find pine needles for my basket weaving. I also have some green ones in here at the bottom. These are some that I collected when they were green, like this bunch, and then allowed them to dry indoors in a dark place to maintain that green color, and now they're ready for dyeing. You always dry your pine needles before using them, and don't use the fresh ones because they shrink as they dry, and if you wove or coiled your basket with fresh needles, once the pine needles dried, all your stitching would be really loose. So that's a little bit about the pine needles. And again, you can find out more information on gathering and preserving and storing and all of that in this video here and in the description below. Next up, you're going to need a towel. You're going to work with wet pine needles, so having a towel to catch the drips or to roll up your pine needles. If you are going to take a break, you want to keep them damp, so keeping them in a towel helps that. I also have a soaking bin. This is a bin that has enough space that I can lay the pine needles without them curling or curving, so that they'll be able to soak up water nice and straight. You also need something that can withstand boiling water, because you'll be pouring boiling water over the needles. A pair of sharp, short-bladed scissors are handy for cutting your weaving thread as well as the pine needles. Some sort of pliers. I like to have smooth pliers, pliers that don't have the ridges on the inside, because I use these to help me when I'm pulling the needle through the pine needles in a place where my hand can't grip the needle very well. So having that smooth blade for the plier keeps it from scratching up your sewing needle. Some 2-inch metal spring clamps, tapestry needle, and I have varying sizes depending on what project I'm working on. This guy here has a wide enough eye that I can fit the different sizes of thread that I work with through that eye, but it has a nice pointed end as well, and the circumference isn't very thick, so it can still slide through the pine needles without being so small that it won't pull the thread through. So there's kind of a balance. You're trying to find something that's thick enough that it will pull the thread, the thickness of the thread through, but not so thick that it makes it really difficult to pull through the pine needle coil. You're going to need some sort of gauge, and you can get pine needle basketry gauges online if you want, or you can find a drinking straw. This is just a bendable drinking straw that I cut a short length off of, and I have used this length as a pine needle gauge. Now this is about 1/4 inch in diameter, which ended up being fairly small for my project. So I created this gauge out of cardstock and duct tape, and this is a great way to make just something super simple with materials you probably already have at home, but to dictate the size of the coil that you're creating. What a gauge does is it holds your bundle of pine needles together so that you have a consistent diameter of pine needles. So the gauge sits on the pine needles like this. I would slide more pine needles into this end in the middle of the bundle, and the gauge ensures that your coil ends up the same size around consistently, and it holds your pieces closely together so that you can do your stitching without having to manage all of the different lengths of pine needles at once. So it adds some stability to the pine needles and works as an extra hand to hold your pine needles together as you're stitching. Then you're going to need something to do the stitching with, and you can use imitation sinew like this stuff here. I have it in 2 different colors, or waxed nylon or linen thread, or nylon thread, and I have nylon thread in white here. You can play around with different colors or textures, and you can use raffia, dyed raffia, or just plain imitation raffia. There are a lot of different options that you can use for the thread, and check the description for a full list of options and resources of the material you can use for stitching your pine needle coil baskets. You may want to have some large gauged wire to insert into your coil basket rims or handles if you're adding more detailed work to your baskets. These are all non-tarnish and rust proof, so as you're working with the wet pine needles and as they dry and you do any kind of shellac or finish on the basket, the wire won't rust through the pine needles. If you're interested in using colorful pine needles rather than the browns and the greens that naturally occur, you can use RIT fabric dye to dye your pine needles, and I'll be sharing a video on that soon. So I have multiple different colors here that we'll be playing around with to dye pine needles. If you dye with RIT dye, you'll also need white vinegar and non-iodized salt, but I'll go more into detail on that in a later video. Another thing to have handy to collect your pine needles and bundle them up and have when you're dyeing and in other situations are rubber bands. This just helps to collect your pine needles, and they work great to keep things organized. And then when you're finished with your basket, you'll want to do some sort of finishing, a shellac or a wood finish. I have this clear wood finish in satin. I use this on my rattan basket weaving projects. If you use a spray finish, you'll just need the spray can. Make sure to follow the manufacturer's instructions on the back of the can as far as shaking and all of that goes. I'll be sharing how to finish your pine needle baskets in a video in the future, so check the description below. I'll have that listed there as soon as it comes out. You'll also want a disposable paintbrush. This is a larger one. I use this on my rattan baskets. If you're finishing smaller pine needle baskets or smaller baskets in general, having a smaller 1 or 2 inch wide paintbrush is really handy to apply your shellac or your finish. And then having duct tape handy is useful to mark where you're at in your basket or where you started, or you can use this to create your own gauge like I showed you earlier using cardstock and some duct tape to create a waterproof gauge. You're also going to need boiling water, so either an electric tea kettle, or I have a kettle that sits on my stove. I fill it up with water, boil the water, and then use that to soak my pine needles before I start weaving. And we'll go more into detail on the whole process of weaving in a video soon, so stay tuned for that. Check the description below for the links to that. And thanks for joining me in the studio today. I hope you get prepared with all your tools and materials to start doing some pine needle basketry, because I have more videos coming up soon in the next few weeks on pine needle basketry, going kind of through the process of what it looks like to create a basket, prepare the materials, dye pine needles, and all that good stuff. So be sure to check the description below for links to the resources for all of these things. I'll be combining all the videos and information that I'm learning and gathering and teaching on pine needle basketry in a blog post, so that will be linked in the description below as well. And I'm so glad to have you in the studio once again and to dive into a new year of fiber arts and basketry. So thanks for being here. If you're new to my channel, subscribe. I'd love to have you join the textile indie community by doing that. Check out the community tab for information on upcoming videos, or I just kind of announce some things here and there as I'm creating videos or content here on YouTube and in other places. So check that out if you want more textile indie goodies. Like this video so it gets spread to others that are interested in pine needle basketry or other fiber arts. And I hope you enjoy diving into pine needle basketry with me. Until next time, happy making. See you in my next video.